Call the special session of the Milwaukee City Council to order. Appeal of the Planning Commission's decision to deny master land use file NR 2018005 Elk Rock Estates. Appeal land use file number AP-2019-003, continued from December 3rd, 2019. Public hearing on the appeal of the Planning Commission's decision to deny a natural resources cluster development application, file number NR 2018005 and AP-2019-003 is called to order. Opening this hearing will be based on the same evidence on which the Planning Commission made its decision. On November 19th, Council heard testimony related to the appeal of the Planning Commission's decision. On December 3rd, Council started its deliberation, and today will continue to discuss and work toward a tentative decision. Should Council arrive at a decision at this hearing, the formal decision will be made at the next hearing. No additional testimony will be taken on this matter. If Council determines to tentatively deny the application before taking any final action, Council will provide to the applicant the opportunity to offer an amendment to the application or to proposed conditions of approval. The purpose of this hearing is for Council to consider the appeal filed by Gillis Properties. The appellant has requested that Council reevaluate the evidence and testimony that pertains to the proposed 12-unit natural resource cluster development. Staff will now cite the applicable standards to be considered.
Title 12.16 Access Management, Title 12.24 Clear Vision at Intersections, Title 18.04 Flood Hazard Area, Title 19.301 Low Density Residential Zones, Title 19.401 Willamette Greenway Zone, Title 19.402 Natural Resources, Title 19.504 Site Design Standards, Title 19.505 Building Design Standards, Title 19.600 Off-Street Parking and Loading, Title 19.700 Public Facility Improvements, Title 19.911 Variances, Title 19.1006 Type 3 Review, and Title 19.1010 Appeals.
The order of business will be discussion of site visits, jurisdiction and impartiality, staff update on the appeals since the last hearing, questions or clarification from Council to staff, discussion and motion to continue hearing. The applicant has the burden of proving that the application complies with all relevant criteria of the comprehensive plan and zoning ordinance. The city is in receipt of the appeal, which identifies the issues and the reasons for the appeal. Any party withstanding may appeal the decision of the council to the State Land Use Board of Appeals according to the rules adopted by that board. Persons withstanding are those who testify or sign the council attendance sign-up sheet in the hallway. Has any member of council visited the site? Does any member of council wish to announce any ex parte contacts or conflicts of interest?
No.
I don't know if you want to go first, Lisa.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I have had extensive ex parte contact, and I live across the street, and therefore I am recusing myself from this hearing due to the potential for conflict of interest.
Enjoy your evening.
I declared ex parte contacts at the first hearing back in November. This past week, I did have somebody ask me about this at over coffee, and I did just say that it was still a matter pending, and I gave them sort of, the Cliff Notes version of, it's still pending before us, there'll be a decision, and then the potential appeal to LUBA. But I did not discuss the substance of the application with them.
Anything else?
And I don't feel that that conversation impedes my ability to decide the matter.
Does any audience member wish to challenge a council member's impartiality or ability to participate in this decision? Seeing none. Does any audience member wish to challenge council's jurisdiction over this matter? Also seeing none. Let's proceed to the staff update.
Good evening, Mayor, members of council. The only staff update that we would offer is, was identified in the staff report, just that at tonight's hearing, council is expected to deliberate and reach a tentative decision regarding the appeal of the Planning Commission's denial of the project, and that at the next hearing on December 17th, council would be expected to make their final decision and adopt findings.
Right, does any member of council have questions for the staff? All right, is there council discussion?
Do we have any notes to reiterate the discussion of the last meeting that we had and the comments that we made at that time about approval or denial?
That would be a question for staff.
Well, I have notes that I could read back, but I don't have actual notes that were formal in any way. If you want me to look at my past notes. You have any issue with
I
that?
don't know if that,
If you have specific questions for staff about perhaps something that was discussed, maybe Denny could review his notes to see if he can remind you. However, you're just in the stage of continuing your deliberations from last week. I would probably venture to say, because last week we did not get to a point of a tentative decision, that you're just continuing your deliberations on all issues.
So we were, for sure, sort of rambling and unfocused last week. I mean, it was kind of a stream of consciousness thing, and so I guess I feel like it would have been nice to have notes of that, but maybe we use the recommended findings for denial that were drafted for the Planning Commission back in September as a way to frame our discussion and follow those.
that's what I was thinking also, which is what I have up in front right now. I just want to try to understand one of the things that I think that our attorney had noted to us is, do we need to go through all of the findings or just the 2 or 3 findings on which the Planning Commission based their denial? And I realize we need to address the variances also, but I read, what I thought I read was that we needed to go through the entire staff report.
Correct. You need to make findings on all applicable approval criteria.
Both those that were approved and those that were denied,
Denied.
because this is all new again.
Right. This is a de novo review on the record, and this is the final decision, final local decision that will be appealable to LUBA, and so they need a full decision with decisions on all applicable approval criteria.
Okay, so these September draft recommended findings for denial don't address all criteria. They address things that staff determined were potentially basis for denial, and so the other criteria are deemed to have been met. Is that correct?
That is not correct.
No. Okay.
That is not correct. The staff, and Vera can chime in as she might, but the recommended findings for denial, as well as the recommended findings for support in approval of the proposed development, address all approval criteria.
Right. And those were also, the recommended approvals were also in that September 10th packet. They were
Correct.
just prior to the recommended findings for denial.
Correct.
If I recall, the September 10th packet for denial, did not address the variances.
Is that
That's correct.
So-
is that correct?
No, that's not
No.
what I read either.
Sorry.
Yeah, no.
In the staff report, the findings for denial and the findings for approval with draft conditions of approval covered all of the criteria, including the variances.
did?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was the findings that the Planning Commission ultimately voted on that cribbed everything down to the couple of criteria
Okay.
that they focused on. But the full draft set that we submitted for the September 10th had
And
all of the
one
criteria.
thing, just point of clarification, the dock is no longer part of the application, so even though the September 10 report addresses the dock, we don't have to address the dock.
Right, the dock.
Because it's no
the
longer part of the application.
Approval of the dock is not before you.
Okay.
And I believe the only place it appeared in the on a drawing where it was
Right.
noted as existing. I don't think there were any analysis done by staff because by that time it had already been dropped from the application. Vera can
That's my understanding.
clar-
Yes,
yeah.
we did not go into detail or review the doc.
Sorry, I'm looking at RS, well, actually, no, sorry, I'm not familiar with planning commission pages. 5.1, page 75.
I'm sorry, what are you looking at?
I'm looking at the September 10th planning commission packet, and on page
Are you
7.
looking at the staff report specifically, or the,
I'm looking at the draft, I'm going to direct you to the page. So the page 75 of the draft findings for denial include in the floodways code the discussion about the dock. So I just want to make sure that I've been reviewing the right document.
You have been.
Yes.
Those notes indicate that the approval of a dock will need state authorization and city planning approval after city planning approval is obtained.
Okay.
However, it's not before you for decision on this packet.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm in that same document, and I guess I'm having trouble finding the variances. What page are they?
I can't even find that same doc, because I've got like 5 different ones.
I printed it out because I
Yeah.
knew.
So
I
looks
know
like
that. Wish I could have.
page,
I mean, they're not in numerical order of the code sections because mine end with 19,905 and the variances are 19,911.
So the document that I have is the 867-page one, but it
The
doesn't
compendium.
have
There's only 200.
page numbers and reference numbers on the bottom. It just has page numbers for that particular thing, so
Yeah. Yeah, that.
that was the,
The variances are contained in the recommended findings in support of approval. They're not contained in the denial.
But we kind of went through the variances last week, didn't we?
We did.
Don't you guys have our direction on the variances?
that was where the notes would be held.
If I may, from my notes, through the discussion that council had, that the garage door variance was not something that council appeared to be supportive of. The height variance seemed to be something that was supportable, and that the setback variance was not supportable due to the encroachment onto Spring Park. So those were the three. That was how my notes
That's my
That's
That's my
summarized
recollection too.
that,
Okay,
so.
good. Then we don't have to talk about the variances.
So can you confirm then that that's the direction?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All four of us
Okay.
nodding our heads.
Great.
well, so, I mean, I think Lisa's,
Do you have
sorry,
a,
Councilor Brady, I think you've suggested a framework. Does that-
Well, I just because that's
We
the
have to
place
start
where they're
somewhere.
all laid out and it seemed, yeah.
well, I mean, so I have a whole thing that I'm planning to read, but where I was planning to land was that recommending for denial using all of their
Using everything in here.
everything that they put, and then have further discussions about some of the criteria, the Willamette Greenway in particular, where we bring in some additional things. But if,
Do you want to just start with that?
You know, to be perfectly honest, the first thing in this document is the whole crawl space garage thing underneath the document, underneath the, you know, the
Below.
floodplain level.
Yeah.
And to me, that's kind of the hardest, thorniest issue. So taking this in order may not be the way to go, but, I mean, maybe we want to talk about Willamette Greenway first. Or,
No, I'm fine. If you want to do it in that order, that's fine. I'm just telling you that I'm going to suggest that we use them all, but
Okay.
if there's ones that, you're thinking, well, if you disagree with that, for starters, or if you think there's ones that we need to bolster with more reasoning than what was in the packet originally, for sure. I mean, part of what I have to discuss on that part about the flood hazard and the speed, all that, is part of what I've written. If you want-
Because I wasn't anticipating not having a conversation about each of them. I might not have made notes in the packet that I have on areas where I might have some not discomfort, where I maybe have where I think we need further discussion about
Okay.
adopting all of them, just wholesale. So I think it would be,
You want to discuss that?
I'd rather go through it, because then
Okay.
that gives us
Okay.
the opportunity to actually talk about each one. I don't think it necessarily requires, since we do have these before us, I think that we can probably move through some of them pretty quickly, unless one of us has a concern or an issue with one of the findings. Is that a good?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
So, I mean, I will just say, I didn't have a lot of comments I didn't have any comments really on the first part, because it's been a hard thing to get my head around. I'm not an engineer, and I feel like the lack of, sort of engagement with the engineers to talk about it has been a bit of an impediment. Where, in terms of the mayor saying where he feels like he lands on everything, I feel like I land on the big things being upholding the Planning Commission's decision on the lack of alternatives analysis and the Willamette Greenway. To me, those are the two big things. But,
Yeah,
yeah.
I agree with that.
19.402.
But I
definitely
also,
do.
but if for the record, on further appeal, if that's what we're anticipating might happen, then I think we can have brief conversations about the other findings,
So-
maybe just in order.
May I interject and just say that I would suggest that that's the proper way to go about it. If you just wholesale adopt the conditions of denial recommended by staff, you would essentially be saying that the applicant hasn't met any approval criteria at all. Rather, you could have a denial of the application for a specific piece of criteria or a number of criteria, but yet still find that the applicant met certain criteria.
Right.
So it's really kind of a blending
Right.
of the conditions or the recommended findings in support of approval or the recommended findings in support of denial, however you fall through your deliberations on those issues. But I believe that if you decide that you just want to deny the application based on staff's recommended findings for denial, you will essentially be saying that the applicant hasn't met any approval criteria that's been put in front of him.
I didn't read the draft findings for denial as being that broad, but okay.
Yeah, there were several
Well, I
in
mean,
there.
by
There were
by deliberating on each issue, you come to a decision on each issue, each applicable piece of approval criteria. So if you're saying that, and I believe staff's recommended findings for denial are saying that you have found that they have not met a certain piece of criteria. So adopting it wholesale would mean he hasn't met any of his applicable criteria.
Th-
Whereas
there were-
it can be a mix.
There were several applicable criteria within for things for denial that actually said has been met.
Right.
So it does not wholesale
Sure.
say that they haven't met
Okay,
anything.
okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, you could take it piece by piece.
Yeah.
You could talk about the floodplain, then talk about natural resources in that order. That if there are parts of it that, if you want to adopt the whole floodplain piece, give us that direction. We can
Right.
we
Right.
can carry those forward.
So let's start with the foundation piece. The applicant attempts to create their own floodplain velocities, but whether they're or not they are correct in their assertions is irrelevant, because our code very clearly points to a specific FEMA set of information that is what we are to consider. Until the point at which someone goes through the process with FEMA to change that information for that portion of the river, it is irrelevant to our code, it is irrelevant to our decision. Therefore, the average velocity for that section of the river, not the maximum velocity, mind you, the average velocity across the stream is 5.9 feet per second, which puts it over the 5.0 feet per second threshold in which that sort of foundation is allowed. So
Yes.
that is why I find that one.
And is there language in here specifically?
What's the MMC reference, if that's what we need?
I think the planning
Oh, here we go.
commission's findings for denial on that point in what they adopted is maybe a little more direct to that point than the findings that you will find in the
September
September 10th packet.
I did,
So you're not needing us, I hope, to
If you all agree with that.
verbalize
Yeah.
the exact denial language.
I think if you agree with
Planning
what you
Commission's
just
decision.
stated, that gives us the direction
Okay.
to correct the
So-
findings. If there was anything, and if you're okay with the bulk of the floodplain discussion from the September 10th findings, we can carry those forward. But I mean, I think that's the question for you, if there was something, some other adjustment in there that you wanted to make. I mean, we can make that adjustment to be very clear about that point.
Okay.
Right? Right.
oh, yeah, I do think the language in the planning commission's
Can you read it? I don't know.
actual, in the record, I mean, it seems to me more direct, it just says, federally established flood elevation data is available for the site, the applicable map is X, the flood elevation, well, I guess that's the floodplain, that's not the 5.9. The velocity, that's not the velocity issue. Oh, there it is, bottom of RS 47 in the planning commissions.
Does it say at the top of the
RS
page what it
47?
is? Is that in the findings for denial?
The findings for denial from
Yeah.
October 1st,
Uh-huh.
page 6 and 7 of those, which is RS 47.
6 and 7?
Yeah. Although that doesn't,
So mine at the top, on the top right? 'Cause mine
yeah,
doesn't
6 and
have-
7 is the numbering on the top right rather than RS numbering, because you said you didn't
Yeah,
have
mine-
that.
Yeah, it doesn't have that. We've got like 3 different staff, copies of the staff report, so.
Yeah.
make sure we're all looking at the same pages. Yeah, crawl space construction, yes.
Oh, and on down to 8 and 9 on the, yeah.
Yeah.
FEMA considers high-velocity floods as likely. The FIS table for the nearest cross-section lists 5.9 feet per second as the mean flood velocity.
Yeah, the mean.
The FIS must be revised in order to allow crawl-space construction. This applicant has not demonstrated that proposed foundation types are feasible. I mean, none of this, yeah.
These were the final findings.
None of this is quite as categorical as the way you stated it, and maybe we want it to be more categorical, like our code calls out this, and,
That is.
I mean, I
that
guess
is the
that's what
standard
that's
that must be
saying
met.
by that the applicant has not demonstrated that proposed foundation types are feasible, but, yeah, it's,
We can certainly add that.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, yes. Okay.
Are you okay
So there
with-
you go.
Right,
That one's
right.
done.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Next.
I think we're down to that place.
Just trying to navigate
So is next the chart of low-density residential zones? Have we covered everything in?
What, I think next is the overlay zones and special area zones, natural resources.
Yeah.
Okay.
It would
The
be,
Willamette Greenway and the National Res-
yeah, it would be page 10 of 18 of the original findings.
The adopted findings.
No, I think I'm looking at the,
I was gonna say, none of them are 18 that I have.
Fine.
I have page 10 of
If I could,
17.
No, you're fine. So you're correct that the low-density residential zones chart, because that's approval criteria, and the way the findings were proposed for September 10th was that with conditions, they could be found that the standards, would be met. However, and the way the findings read it sort of brings you back through findings 5, 7A, and 7B, that the overall project had been found to be deficient and is recommended for denial. So that sort of closes the loop that while the standards for 301 might be met, the overall project, based on XYZ findings, that the entire project was found, or the project itself for those findings was found to be deficient. So you're able to find the standards for the low-density residential zones to be met with conditions. However, so yes, we would still need to cover those criteria as part of the approval criteria. But there are other findings that it appears that you are finding that the project is deficient, if that makes sense.
I apologize, I was in the final set of findings for the commission.
I'm okay, I mean, I looked through this chart already. Yeah, so we're granting the variances number 6 in the chart. And we've agreed that we're approving that, and I don't really see a problem with the chart.
Yeah. That was, I think, the one, yeah, and maybe that was I was sort of conflating and confusing, so.
That it was there.
Right,
made
that
it
it was,
part of
but that it was
There
met.
was a denial, yes.
Right,
There are
okay.
several things, and that's the.
It's okay, well,
Great.
Yeah. Okay.
okay, so then we're left with,
Overlay zones?
on that overlay zone, Willamette Greenway. Um, what jumped out at me is, so on 19401.6 criteria, I made a note that the majority of the floodplain is undeveloped and not appropriate for urban use.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
That the majority of the floodplain is undeveloped and not appropriate for urban use.
Yeah, what was the MMC?
On, no, I don't,
19401.1.
Point one, yeah.
.6.
Oh, sorry, .6.
Yeah, under-
.1 is purpose. I was going to read the purpose of the Willamette Greenway out, just so that
Oh, well,
we all have
Yeah.
that in our head. The purpose of the Willamette Greenway Zone is to protect, conserve, enhance, and maintain the natural, scenic, historic, economic, and recreational qualities of lands along the Willamette River and major courses flowing into the Willamette River. So then the criteria, as you say, are 6. I also found that in the Greenway criteria that the development is not compatible with the scenic, natural, and recreational character of the river.
Yes.
I also find it does not maintain the emphasis on water-oriented and recreational uses. In fact, it would preclude it. And most importantly, it does not conform to the applicable comp plan policies as noted above, which this is the very last thing I wrote. So, as noted in the things I haven't read to you yet, regarding flood hazard.
Yeah, the flood hazard.
All right, can you go back through those again?
Uh-huh.
There's one of those I think I had a quibble with.
Okay. I find that development is not compatible with the scenic, natural, and recreational character of the river.
Oh, so yeah, the recreational piece. I mean, I went kind of back and forth on that too, but I mean, I think there's something in the Willamette Greenway planning rule that says you're not taking away private property rights, right? So it's, we can't expect it to be a private lot to be a recreational use.
No, but state law also allows access to the bank on
Oh, it
all
does?
navigable rivers.
That's true.
And when you've dug a man trap into your portion of the
Mayor,
bank,
I'd like to point you that I don't believe that information's in the record before you.
it's part of the Greenway
The
inference.
state law about access to the banks.
That's part of, if you read the Willamette Greenway,
It says
what is the,
public access to the river.
what is
Goal
the
15.
public access to the river? That's part of the, what am I,
State planning rule 15?
15, Willamette Greenway, which is what our Willamette Greenway section references. So access to the riverbank is allowed. And this current design has a large hole in the riverbank. And so, in any case, it does not maintain emphasis on water-oriented and recreational uses.
Doesn't comply with the relative standards of the area, the Willamette Greenway area.
I mean, I guess I feel like emphasizing that point puts an applicant, any applicant, in a catch-22 because we're saying it's not suitable for development and that there's safety and hazard and everything else issues, and yet we want to encourage recreational use,
Well, the hazards are occurring occasionally,
seasonal, yeah.
right, when it's flooding.
Right.
And when it's not flooding, it's
Right.
recreational.
Right.
Fishermen, the kayakers, the stand-up paddleboarders.
so I guess to get at the public access, so under, I'm looking at page 77 on the September 10th packet.
Is there a number at the top? Because mine doesn't have numbers at the bottom.
So for the
12
August, the
of-
one that's dated
See, I
August
only have 12 of
27th.
25.
Yeah, it's page 12 through then 13 of 25.
This is the
But
October 1st
you're on the
one.
October, she's on,
Right, but
I'm on
But it's
August.
the staff report
Right,
from
the
September.
September 10th staff report, that's where
Yeah.
I am.
Okay,
And so it's on pages 12 of 25 to 13.
okay.
And so I'm just looking under, again, 19-401-6 criteria for approval. And then now, let me make sure I don't lose my place. E, public access to and along the river to the greatest possible degree by appropriate legal means. No public access is provided by the development. The subject properties are private residential properties that are adjacent to the river. The proposed development would only provide access to the river. So I suppose just in terms of Mayor finding a place in the record where that's discussed.
There it is.
I think there's a typo right there.
And there's a missing,
I think that the text.
the E is too
the
high.
Italic text goes with D, and then the E is supposed to go with public access to and along the river.
Yeah, but that's what she read.
But that's
Yeah,
what I read,
yeah,
so.
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
And let's see, where is my note on? Are we still in the same place? Yeah, so, and then under policy 1, under the environmental and natural resources objective 2 states in part, protect designated natural resources and their associated values through preservation, intergovernmental coordination, conservation, mitigation, and acquisition of resources. Where's my note there? Why isn't that popping up? I think it might have moved. Let me find. Sorry, it's actually it's actually policy number 4 under natural hazards element objective 1. Whenever possible, the floodplain will be retained as open space and used for recreation, wildlife areas or trails. Dedication of lands or public easements within the floodplain is encouraged when indicated by the recreational needs element and may be required as condition of development along creeks and rivers or other water bodies or wetlands. There is no proposal to dedicate lands or public easement in this application.
And so
And so I feel that that doesn't conform with the policies and
with the
objectives.
recreational, going back to the recreational,
Yeah.
okay, fair enough. Fair enough. I think one place in particular, just above where we were noting the misplaced E, the staff report discussion of D, landscaping, aesthetic enhancement, open space and vegetation between the activity and the river to the maximum extent practicable. This is one of the big places I think this application fails. And so this, I mean, although what staff has here is accurate, I think it's accurate, it's definitely an opportunity to, it's a site that is a mess, has not been maintained, or has not, does not have natural vegetation, and there's the opportunity to restore that, but the proposal is not providing these things to the maximum extent practicable. I think we need to explicitly say that.
Well, the development itself proposes substantial permanent disruption in the 100-year floodplain.
Right.
Yep.
Do we have further discussion on?
Willamette Greenway section.
There's also a reference to the dock in here. Are we supposed to be
We're supposed to ignore that.
reviewing them? I mean, removing them? Under F. I don't know if we're supposed to be removing those as we encounter them or not, but,
Well, if the dock's off the table, it's off the table, and it
Yeah.
shouldn't be.
Oh, well,
part
then
of-
it can't be, okay, I see. Oh, so we can't consider it as a water-oriented or recreational use? I mean, that would be in furthering.
But that was a private use in any case. which-
Like, I mean,
Not
F
public.
doesn't say emphasis on public, so, but since there is no dock anymore, that's not met.
I have to assume that's intended. What do I have the 11 greenway?
I made a note here, but I don't know what page I was referring to, but it was in reference to MMC 19.402.11. The plant mitigation area was not appropriate due to the periodic flooding and accessibility.
411, that's
402.11.
402.11, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
19.402.11 is the MMC for that.
Oh, there we go. It's on page 16 of 25.
Yeah, and it was, and my next note on that was that 19.402.12 was not met. And I think that's on page 91 of the staff report. One little note I have there. Those are all under the
Natural
overlay.
resources, right.
They're all under, I'm sorry,
Natural resources.
Oh,
that's natural
right.
resources.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, under natural resources, I find that the project does not avoid the HCA or the WQR to the greatest extent practicable.
Where are you guys? Good eye.
Yeah.
Again.
Wow. 19, so,
Well, 402.11 is at page 16 of 25 in those September findings of denial. And there's a long,
Yeah, I got it.
there's a long thing about the plants. And I mean, I have to say, the planting plan here is very ambitious, and I like it. I mean, it would be lovely to have it, but I do think that yeah. I mean, so I guess a question about the interplay of these provisions in the Natural Resources Code. So this kind of standard, 19402.11, this kind of answer, this kind of analysis and finding would make sense if you didn't have the alternative, the basis for the Planning Commission's denial, the lack of an alternatives analysis. So how do those pieces fit together? I mean, how do you
Compromise?
or how do you reconcile
Reconcile,
them?
that's a better word, thank you, yeah.
I mean, we talked about this last time, and I think for me, the way I could understand why they didn't get further in their review once you meet the obstacle of not considering no serious consideration for the alternative that would have avoided the WQA and the HCA. And so, like you say, the mitigation plan, had serious consideration been given to avoiding, to the extent practicable, then we could get to a conversation about whether the mitigation plan was appropriate. But how can we evaluate, how can we determine that the mitigation plan is appropriate if we've already decided, or if we say, you're starting out at the wrong point?
Right. Right. So does that mean our finding should just be a short sentence saying that and not all of this? That says,
I mean, I suppose I want to, I guess this is a process, I hope this is a process question. At the end of this, when we have to give an opportunity to provide an amendment, or, and so I suppose, I guess I think that we might want to include as much as possible short answer is I don't think I'd want to remove all of that discussion, because I think it's informative. I think it's helpful. I think if we're saying if we are here now, we're saying at the council level that mitigation plan would have been acceptable had you actually done the other things that you were obligated to do, then that might be a guide, I guess, moving forward.
Yeah, we can add that type of language here. It's not.
like that council doesn't find it met because
It was not
it was not studied
avoided.
from,
The mitigation plan
Did not avoid the HCA
is based on a
WQR
faulty
conditions.
proposal,
right.
right? Because we find that there was no consideration for an alternative that avoids, and so, I guess now I'm talking myself out of what I just said, because maybe the mitigation plan would have been different had a completely different proposal been proposed or designed.
Well, yeah, almost certainly if they didn't disturb this much, they wouldn't propose this kind of
They would
a.
propose a better mitigation
Yeah.
plan, potentially, or not. Sure. But yeah.
And I also think maybe a discussion of practicable, because that often is a place that, from the applicant standpoint, practicable, generally speaking, translates to, is it affordable? Is it
Well, in fact, that's made
financially-
by counsel for the applicant several times in
Right.
his letters, yes. yes.
And while it is one of the, 8 things named in the conversation of practicable, so is hazards. There are many considerations in there, and having simply one that makes it, and furthermore, does practicable mean maximizing profit, or does it just mean able to build something, right? There's a big span in there between the most that could possibly be built for the most possible income and developing property.
So which
Okay, well-
which code is prompting you to talk about practicable? Because what
Yeah.
we were
Said
just talking about
practicable.
doesn't
Yes, it
have.
does.
It does?
Sure, when you talk about avoiding or
Oh, that might, but the development standards.
the project does
that-
not avoid the HCA or the WQR to the greatest extent practicable. Practicable is the operative word in that whole code. It's the one that developers always hang their hat on.
Mitigate adverse impacts if there is no practicable alternative to avoid.
Yes.
Well, and in the record, so the lawyer's letter and the testimony, the evidence on cost that we have in front of us is about removal of the existing houses. And they rely heavily on that cost. in determining whether or not it's practicable. And from my perspective, since they didn't seriously consider options that they were operating, it seemed that any other considerations necessarily required the removal of those two houses, but there was no serious consideration of both avoiding so much disturbance in the WQR and the HCA, and also keeping those two residences. For example, 3 fourplexes would satisfy the 12-unit minimum, maximum, whatever we want to call that.
It's both, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to your point, that there are all of these other factors, and the one that they rely on most, I think.
Is cost.
Yeah,
And,
right.
and defining cost by maximizing potential, financial potential.
Yeah.
What's the next one?
Do you need more on natural resources?
Well, I actually have one back on Willamette Greenway.
Oh,
That was the
sorry.
thing I was, so we kind of talked about it, and Council President Falconer read from it, but on page 14 of 25, there's policy number 4 from the comp plan, policy number 4 under natural hazards element, objective 1. And and I mean, that sounds like it should be under hazards, but it's actually part of the Greenway. And I think we need to more explicitly say, this is not met. Whenever possible, the floodplain will be retained as open space. Dedication of public easements is encouraged, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the proposed finding here says that it's is contrary to the objectives and policies. I guess, I mean, I don't know. I guess that's all right. I mean, I feel like it should be a little stronger, but I guess that's all right.
Well, if you've got a stronger way to say it.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, it speaks to how it's contrary
Comp
to
plan.
our objectives and
Policies.
policies, so therefore probably contrary to our comp
And
plan.
therefore, yeah, I would insert maybe the word comprehensive plan before objectives and policy, and then I would maybe add a sentence that says, therefore, this element of the Willamette Greenway is not met, you know. This conformance to applicable plan policies is not met. I would just like to maybe say that more explicitly.
Okay, good.
Okay. So staff, taking notes on that one.
Yep.
So I don't know where we landed on the 19-402-11 development standards, the mitigation and stuff. Are we keeping that in text, that long text in? Are we taking it out? Are we, and substituting a shorter statement about how?
What if we add a sentence?
Are you trying to clarify it more, or or provide opportunity for,
Well, in finding that, because no serious consideration was given to an alternative that truly minimizes the impact, this- because that must be done, we find that the proposed mitigation is not, does not meet the criteria.
I wrote, when you stated this earlier, I wrote, with no serious consideration to avoid or minimize, you can't talk about adequate mitigation if there hasn't been an appropriate alternatives analysis. So,
And,
you know, but
and
it
so
was-
this is not met.
Yeah, so the mitigation plan is a faulty proposal, but would have been a different, had there been a different mitigation, and would, because the mitigation plan is based on a faulty proposal, and it would have been a different mitigation plan had the proposal been acceptable. So, I mean, I think with this approach, I think we can craft something. Now, the question I have is, do you want to leave the remainder of that discussion? Because at one point you said, we were going down the line and said, if that had been an acceptable proposal, this mitigation plan would seem appropriate. You want to leave something like that in there?
No,
No.
no.
Okay.
Because, based on what you just said, which is, had there been serious consideration of an alternative, I think it necessarily would have been a different mitigation plan.
yeah.
Okay.
I think that's right.
So, do we strip out on page 16 of 25, number 4, do we strip out all that text?
I think so. I think that's what we just,
Yeah.
I mean, and you write something based on those notes, yeah. That's just a sentence or two.
Do you want to keep anything in like that last, the top, page 17? Okay,
I don't think it's in line with
all right.
our discussion.
Right. I mean, yeah.
But I think it,
It goes with the paragraph before it, too.
right.
Okay.
I mean, I think we're hinging our finding on the inadequate alternatives analysis. And this is something else.
Next.
So, yeah, so let's talk about that alternative analysis page, which is 18 of 25. I think we want to make the point that none of the studied alternatives met the maximum density. They're all in excess of the maximum density. And so,
So they weren't actually,
they weren't really
Viable
viable
alternatives.
alternatives, yeah.
And they all, and I think we probably did discuss both of these things last time, but just to put a point on it, they also all impact more
Right,
than
Right.
the,
Right.
than,
Right.
so no alternative that impacted less or met the density requirement.
actually, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and looking at the planning commission's findings on that, I think they get into more issues, they get into parking. Oh, no, I'm sorry, they're talking about the back and forth. Yeah, so I mean, I think that point, I mean, generally their findings look good, but I do think needs to be made, those points that more explicitly than they're made here, that none of the alternatives studied the 12 dwelling units at the maximum density, and none of them, and all of them disturbed more, yeah. Yeah.
Back to MMC 19.402.12 and 11. 12.
402.12,
Yeah.
and what's the issue?
So that's page 21 of 25. That's on the,
It's 21 of
it's
20?
still the evaluation of impacts to the water quality resource area.
Oh, okay.
And that the planning commission had found that the proposed development didn't meet the discretionary standards for disturbance of the HCA's as established in 19.402.12C. So I don't know if we need to take that one separately or if what we've already said covers that. It's all about the basic area.
Well, so that gets to something we definitely spent a lot of time on last time, and I don't know how that should be reflected in the findings, but yeah, that you don't get to mitigate until you've studied
Avoid or
avoid.
minimize, yeah.
Yeah, avoid and minimize. And so a lot of these
Yeah.
things about mitigate, I mean, should they just be a shorter statement like we just did with the mitigation plantings? There's more passages like that, and should they just be shorter bases that say, this question is not properly addressed because the alternatives analysis wasn't done?
Well, is it just that the alternatives analysis wasn't done, or that the plan does not minimize, nor does it, I mean, it's like it goes straight to mitigate. It isn't the actual fact that that's where we are, rather than the fact that they did or didn't consider other ideas.
I think you have to mitigate anytime you minimize,
Disturb.
right?
Right.
So-
But they didn't avoid, and they didn't really minimize.
The planning commission's findings, they're connected, right? The alternatives analysis and then the avoid, minimize, mitigate. So you need to show that there, an alternatives analysis that does those things, that provided those, and so they go together. So if there's a deficient alternatives analysis, then the avoid, minimize, mitigate is similarly deficient
Standard
because
is
it's
not
based
met.
on a deficient alternatives analysis. So I think we can
Yeah.
circle, like, connect the two that way with similar language that you just talked about in the alternatives analysis as well. And the submitted findings for those approval criteria of the avoid, minimize, mitigate, as noted in the discussion above, or it sort of, they're trying to connect the two with the alternatives analysis and with that as well. So I think we could do that, certainly, the same for yours as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Doesn't make sense to repeat the same thing. We can.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's better to cross-reference than repeat stuff, because then you always run the risk of being inconsistent or
Right.
whatever, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I have no more notes.
No, I
I'm
don't
sure the
either.
mayor does, though. He's got a,
I do know, I'm not sure that we've actually talked about this. On page 23, one of the comments the Planning Commission made was that on item 6, where it says that the proposed use is consistent with the applicable comprehensive plan policies related to the proposed use. The proposed use is the discretionary use of the residential cluster development. And they find that, as addressed in finding 7A, up above, talking about that it's not consistent with all relevant policies of the comprehensive plan. So it goes back to the basic issue. It's not in sync with the comprehensive plan. So they found that that standard wasn't met.
Well, these are the draft findings. The
Right.
commission didn't address.
Right.
These-
They didn't address
Yeah,
that in
yeah.
the final one? Okay.
No, they did two and
they only
stopped.
did two, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they only
Okay.
did two things and stopped, yeah.
Well, there's a couple of pieces I do want to address in this, and I want to be part of the record. So there's been an argument made that that there's not a clear and objective standard. It's clear and objective path. And I disagree. But, and I'll get to that. But first, I want, should this go to LUBA, them to hear the reason there can't always be a clear and objective path for every single kind of development is simple. Things change, codes become out of date. Certain types of developments in certain areas will always need the eyes of an impartial but informed group of local people familiar with local conditions and realities, like our Planning Commission. Because no code can ever be written to cover every contingency that could possibly arise, and the tendency for code to become out of date due to lack of funds is highly likely. Climate change is precisely such a contingency. We know for a fact that in the coming decades, flooding will become more frequent and more intense and more damaging. Climate change was talked about in testimony. Furthermore, we do have clear and objective path for development of this property, and the applicant chose to ignore that. In that clear and objective path, they would have been able to build 2 duplexes on the site of 2 existing homes. I believe that the home buyers have the right to assume that a brand-new house will be safe for the foreseeable future. They have the right to assume that a developer built a quality house and that the city would not allow a house to be built if it was unsafe. We know that storms and flooding will become more severe going forward, and our Willamette Greenway section of our comprehensive plan clearly addresses hazards such as flooding to be a consideration. The current 100-year floodplain is clearly inaccurate. That is our current reality. Many cities all over the world are experiencing 100 and even 500-year flooding on an annual basis. So, I want to read into the record also 1804 flood hazard areas.
Not the record.
Read into
Your
whatever.
deliberation, yeah.
Thank you. 1804.01, the purpose of the flood hazard areas. It is the purpose of this chapter to promote the public health, safety, and general welfare and to minimize public and private losses due to flood conditions in specific areas by provisions designed to A, protect human life and health, B, to minimize expenditure of public money in costly flood control projects, C, to minimize the need for rescue and relief efforts associated with flooding and generally undertaken at the expense of the general public, E, to minimize damage to the public facilities and utilities such as water and gas mains, electric, telephone, and sewer lines, streets, bridges located near the area of the special flood hazard, to ensure that potential buyers are notified that property is in an area of special flood hazard, to ensure that those who occupy the area of a special flood hazard assume responsibility for their actions, and to maintain the function and values of floodplains, such as allowing for storage and conveyance of stream flows through existing and natural conveyance systems. I think it's also important to read the methods for reducing flood losses. In order to accomplish its purposes, this chapter includes methods and provisions for A, restricting or prohibiting uses which are dangerous to health, safety, and property due to water or erosion hazards, or which result in damaging increases in erosion or in flood heights or velocities. B, requiring that uses vulnerable to floods, including facilities which serve such uses, be protected against flood damage at the time of initial construction. C, controlling the alteration of natural flood paths, stream channels, and natural protective barriers which help accommodate or channel floodwaters. D, controlling, filling, grading, dredging, or other development which may increase flood damage. And E, preventing or regulating the construction of flood barriers which will unnaturally divert floodwaters or which may increase flood hazards in other areas.
I object to that in the record. It wasn't previously in the record.
It is part of the code, however.
MMC 1804.
It's directly,
He's entitled to object if he wants to object. You don't have to defend it.
Sorry, just clarifying though that MMC 1804
yes.
is.
Yeah, those are provisions in the code.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Can I object to his objection?
That's not proper procedure.
Did you complete your work on the conditional use criteria, or was there anything else? Is there anything else you were going to add or discuss on that? That's pages 22, I think. Yeah, 22, 23. Yeah, 22 and 23.
That's the 19905, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think you talked about Commissioner Parks, or Councilor Parks had brought up the point about the conditions, or I mean the comp plan policies, and then we shifted
and then
off
we
of
didn't.
that. Most of the criteria are addressed on page 22 under B. But just basically, I'm wondering if you want to just keep these.
Yeah,
For some reason, that's fine.
it doesn't comply with the relevant standards of the floodplain hazard area, the Willamette Greenway Zone, and the National Resources, or Natural Resources Code. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, it was.
Keeping that?
It's the, it's just, I wanted to make sure
It's
that
page 20, it's all of
if you
these
wanted
on
to
page
include
20.
this, you have acknowledged that you wanted to include this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
Yes.
yes, yes.
That's all I needed.
Okay.
The, your note, 1804, I just wanted to,
The purpose or the methods?
okay, no, that's okay, I just wanted the numbers.
Anybody else have anything else?
I don't have anything else. I came to the end of my page.
You ran out of paper, so you were done.
No, I ran out of the end
I
of
don't
that,
have
too.
that.
I thought it would never happen.
Yeah, no, okay. I mean, I guess a question for our attorney. So these are our criteria, they're listed here, and we've gone through them. This needed housing argument that applicant's attorney has made is not our criteria.
That's
So are we supposed to address it in any way?
No.
Is it wouldn't,
I-
it
I-
wouldn't really be, there wouldn't be a kind of
It's
a,
a legal argument
Yeah.
that you're not required to make at this stage. Your job is to review the applicable criteria and determine whether or not the applicant has met it.
okay,
The needed housing statutes, it's kind of a legal argument based on legislation, and you've received some advice on that from
I mean, we
counsel,
definitely
and
discussed that
it's in the
last
record.
meeting sometime, you
Sure.
know, to some extent, but, and
And
he,
you're welcome to deliberate it any further. I don't believe there is any finding that you need to make
Okay,
on the
that's-
application.
that's what I want to know. I mean, I think we discussed it pretty well last time.
All right, then, before I entertain a motion to continue the hearing and given the council's direction to staff to prepare findings for denial per ORS 197.5223, the applicant is now provided with the opportunity to offer an amendment to the application or to propose conditions of approval that would make the application consistent with the comprehensive plan and the applicable regulations. Any amendment or conditions of approval must be submitted in advance of the December 17th public hearings for consideration. This material must be submitted to the city by noon on Thursday, December 12th, 2019.
Wait, hold on.
I'm sorry, I believe you have that date
Well,
incorrect.
all I'm doing is reading
Yeah.
this, so
I think that-
what are the
yeah,
dates?
I know, I think it might have been mistyped.
I think we were talking about Monday,
The 16th.
the
16th.
16th, okay.
At noon?
So the last line is that the material must be submitted by Monday, the 16th?
Correct.
Okay. So you want me to start completely over?
I believe it's understood.
All right.
I move to continue the hearing to a date certain of December 17th, 2019.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded to continue the hearing to a date certain of December 17th, 2019. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? None heard.
I move to
The hearing-
adjourn.
The hearing
Oh,
is
you
continued.
I seconded the motion.
Motion to adjourn. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are
Will just
adjourned.
not in favor.
No, I know.